All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a look at, well, medieval theories of the
Ooh,
categories.
exciting.
It is. How did thinkers centuries ago, how did they try to wrangle with these fundamental philosophical questions, right? About like reality and how we think about it and how we even talk about it, these questions that probably still puzzle a philosopher today.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, right? To sort of like step back in time and see how these issues were grappled with, long before we had like all the fancy jargon and all the frameworks that we have today.
Exactly, exactly. And you, dear listener, are one such philosopher. And this deep dive is really for you. We're going to be looking at excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on the subject, and it really is a deep dive.
Yeah, it's pretty dense, but it's also like really rich with these interesting arguments and perspectives.
It is. And before we go any further, maybe we should just sort of like clarify what we mean by categories in this context. We're
Right.
not talking about like sorting books in a library or anything like
Right,
that.
right. No Dewey Decimal System here.
No, no. We're talking about the most general ways of classifying, the things that we talk and think about, like the most basic building blocks of our conceptual understanding, right?
Yeah, like the fundamental categories of being, the ultimate kinds of things that exist.
Exactly. And it's interesting because, you have some philosophical traditions that like embrace, a huge number of categories, but medieval thinkers, they actually tended to follow Aristotle's sort of like narrower view. So they were really, really focused on these like core distinctions, as opposed to having this like expansive, taxonomy of every possible category.
Yeah, and that's actually quite a common thread in medieval philosophy, right? This focus on like structure and order and these fundamental principles. It's more architectonic approach, you might say.
Yeah, yeah. So our mission in this deep dive is to unpack, how did medieval philosophers conceive of these categories? Like what were the major points of disagreements, among them, and why do we even care, right? Like why are these historical debates still philosophically relevant today?
Right. Well, I think, for one thing, it's just intrinsically fascinating to see how brilliant minds from, centuries ago wrestled with these really fundamental questions about like the nature of reality, how we know things, how language works. And these are questions that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And what's amazing is that, even today, even with all the scholarship that's been done, we're still like uncovering nuances and complexities in these medieval arguments. It's a surprisingly like, rich and evolving field of study.
Yeah. There's always more to discover, right? It's not like a closed book.
So let's get into it. Let's dive into like the core issues that they were grappling with.
Okay, that's good.
When it came to categories, medieval thinkers weren't just like compiling lists, right?
Right. They were doing real philosophy here.
Yeah, yeah, they were engaged in these really, really intricate debates, and the source kind of identifies like 10 broad groups of issues, that were sort of swirling around this whole topic.
10. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot, but we'll break it down. So the first cluster has to do with what are called like extensional issues.
Okay,
Okay.
extensional. So
Yeah.
so that's about like, what's included in each category, how many members are there, that kind of thing.
Right. So the fundamental question here is like how many categories are there?
Right. That's kind of a basic question, isn't it?
It is. It is. And Aristotle famously proposed, 10.
Yeah.
But even his own texts, sometimes you find like some variations, and then you have like later thinkers like Plotinus and Spinoza who really tried to like reduce that number down, to like a really, really small set of categories.
Yeah, they were all about like simplifying things,
Yeah.
finding the most fundamental principles.
Exactly. And medieval philosophers, they generally adhered to like a smaller number, often aligning with Aristotle's 10, but there was still like discussion, right? Like exactly how many should there be and how do we justify that?
Right. It's not like they just accepted Aristotle's word for it. They
Mhm.
they really wanted to get to the bottom of it.
Exactly. And then we have the intentional issue. So this is all about like what are these categories in their essence?
It's just
Right.
intentional. So
Yeah.
so we're moving beyond just like what's included in them,
Yeah.
and we're asking like what's the nature of the categories themselves.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
what defines them? Can we even provide a definition for a category?
That's a good question. Can you define like substance or quality in a way that captures their like essential nature.
Well, that's the thing, right? A lot of medieval authors actually argue that you can't define categories.
You can't. Why not?
Well, because they understood categories as being like the most fundamental divisions of being itself, right?
Good.
Like think about it this way, right? You know how in a normal definition you place the thing you're defining into a broader category, a genus, and then you differentiate it from other things in that genus.
Yeah, like a dog is a mammal that barks and wags its tail or something like that.
Exactly. But the thing is, for medieval thinkers, being itself wasn't considered to be a genus.
It wasn't.
No, because it's so fundamental, it's so universal, right? It encompasses everything. There's no broader category that it fits into.
Oh, I see. So you can't define categories because they're like the most basic kinds of things. There's nothing more fundamental to compare them to.
Exactly. And there's nothing outside the categories to differentiate them from.
That's a really subtle point, but it makes sense when you think about it.
It does. It does. All right, and then we have the ontological issues.
Ah, ontology. Now we're getting to the good stuff.
This is where things get really, really interesting. Because, this is all about like what is the status of these categories in reality?
Right. Are they things that exist out there in the world independently of us?
Or are they just like concepts in our minds?
Or maybe they're just like linguistic conventions, just ways that we've agreed to talk about things.
Right, right. And medieval thinkers, they explored all of these possibilities. They argued for categories as linguistic entities. They argued for them as mental constructs, and they argued for them as features of an external reality.
So they were open to all these different perspectives.
They were, but a really, really influential perspective during the Middle Ages was what's called the inclusive view.
Inclusive view. What's that?
This was the idea that categories are actually like simultaneously words and concepts and properties.
Whoa, they're all three at the same time.
Yeah, it's kind of a way of trying to hold all these different perspectives together. So like from one perspective, you can view categories as words, right? Like just the terms that we use to label things. But from another perspective, you can see them as concepts, like the mental representations that we have of those things. And then from yet another perspective, you can see them as properties, like features that actually exist out there in the world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that could work.
Yeah.
It's like looking at the same thing from different angles.
Exactly.
But still, that leaves the big question, right? Like, do our categories actually reflect the way reality is? Or are they just like our own mental projections?
Exactly. That's the fundamental tension that runs through so much of medieval debate on this topic.
Right. Like, is there a world out there that corresponds to our categories, or are we just imposing our own categories onto the world?
Exactly. Okay, so now we have some sense of like what they thought categories were, right? How many there might be. But how did they understand like the origin of these categories?
Oh, right. The causal issues, like where do these categories come from in the first place?
Exactly. I mean, I imagine that, their approach was probably quite different from like contemporary ideas about, social construction and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. Like Foucault was not on their reading list.
Right. Right. No, their understanding of how categories are established was really, really deeply intertwined with their ontological status. So like if categories reside in the mind, then their origin is mental activity, right?
Okay, so if categories are mental constructs, they arise from our minds. Makes sense.
But if they exist extramentally, if they're really out there in the world, then their source has to lie in the structure of reality itself.
So the origin of categories depends on whether you think they're mental or extramental.
Exactly. And the whole idea of categories being like socially constructed, in that kind of like Foucauldian sense,
Yeah.
that wasn't really a framework that they were operating within.
Interesting. So their focus was more on the mind and reality rather than on the social and cultural factors that might shape our categories.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got like what categories are, maybe how many there are, where they come from, but how did they think we come to know them?
Ah, yes. The epistemological issues. How do we gain access to these categories? How do we know that our categories are correct?
Exactly. And this became a really, really prominent area of like investigation later in the Middle Ages. Thinkers were really grappling with with like, the criteria for determining like the number and the nature of categories.
I can imagine that getting pretty complex.
It does. And it was very much tied up with the perceived relationship between language, thought, and reality.
Right, because if you think about it, categories are kind of at the intersection of all three of those things.
Exactly. And so the big question is like, is there a perfect mirroring? Like what we now call isomorphism.
Isomorphism.
Yeah, it's a fancy word, but it basically means like a one-to-one correspondence. So like, is there a perfect one-to-one correspondence between the words we use,
Right.
the concepts we hold in our minds, and the way the world is like fundamentally structured?
So like, does our language perfectly reflect our thoughts, and do our thoughts perfectly reflect reality?
Exactly. Or do these domains like diverge? Is there a mismatch somewhere?
Right. Like maybe our language is limited in a way that our thoughts aren't, or maybe our thoughts are biased in a way that reality isn't.
Exactly, exactly. And this question of isomorphism, this was absolutely central to the whole, medieval debate on categories.
It makes sense. It's a pretty fundamental question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, how well do our categories map onto the real world?
It is. It is. And then, this naturally leads to linguistic issues.
Linguistic issue.
Yeah, this is all about the specific terms that are used, to denote these categories and how those terms like actually function within language.
Oh, so like, are there specific words for each category, and how do those words relate to each other?
Exactly. And this must have been particularly important for those thinkers who really like lean towards a linguistic understanding of categories,
Yeah,
right?
because you think that categories are primarily linguistic phenomena, then the words themselves become really, really important.
Exactly, exactly. But even for thinkers who didn't necessarily hold that view, there was still a lot of attention paid to like the linguistic articulation of these categories. How do these terms signify? What are their like logical properties and relationships?
So they were doing like philosophy of language alongside their metaphysics in a way.
Absolutely. And then shifting gears a little bit, we have the philosophy of mind. So how did they conceptualize the status of categories within the mind?
Oh, right. So not just how they exist out in the world, but how they exist in our heads.
Exactly. And here, the famous medieval debates concerning universals become really, really relevant.
Universals. Oh, right. Those things.
Yeah, yeah. So the status of categories in the mind was often discussed in direct parallel with the status of general concepts.
Okay. So, like, is the category of substance something that exists in my mind? Or is it just a way of grouping together individual substances that I've experienced?
Exactly, exactly. And the answers varied considerably, right? Like some people thought that categories were like these innate structures of understanding that we're born with.
Okay, so kind of like hardwired into our brain.
Exactly. Whereas others thought that they were derived from our sensory experience.
So we build up our categories through interacting with the world.
Exactly. And this really, really reflects their broader theories about the nature of universals, right?
Right, because if you think that universals are real things that exist independently of our minds, then you're more likely to think that categories are also real things that exist in our mind.
Exactly, exactly. And it's interesting to note that, social, political, and what are called, axiological issues.
Axiological.
Axiological. So that's about values, like the value and societal impact of categories.
Okay.
Those really weren't explicitly addressed in the Middle Ages.
You weren't? Huh. That's kind of surprising, considering how much attention we pay to those issues today.
It is. It is. It's a significant difference, between the medieval perspective and some contemporary philosophical analyses. Nowadays, a lot of philosophers are really interested in examining how, our systems of categorization can actually shape like social and political realities.
Yeah, like how the categories we use can reinforce power structures or perpetuate biases.
Exactly, exactly. And often, with a really critical eye towards those power structures and biases.
Right. But it sounds like that kind of critical evaluation wasn't really on the radar for medieval thinkers.
It really wasn't. Their focus was much more on, the metaphysical and epistemological questions rather than the ethical and political implications.
Interesting. So different set of priorities.
Definitely. And then finally, we have the meta-disciplinary issues.
Meta-disciplinary. Okay, now we're getting really meta.
It is. It is. So this is the question of like which academic discipline is best suited to study categories.
Oh, right. So, like, is it grammar or logic? or
Or
metaphysics.
exactly. And it seems like their answer to this question was really, really tied to their fundamental understanding of what categories actually are.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, if you think categories are primarily linguistic things, then grammar would be the natural place to study them.
Exactly. Whereas if you think they're like fundamental features of reality, then metaphysics would be the more appropriate discipline.
Right, because metaphysics is all about the ultimate nature of reality.
Exactly. And a lot of late medieval authors directly engaged with this question. You have different thinkers championing different disciplines.
So there wasn't really a consensus on this.
No, not really. It was very much a matter of debate. And of course, throughout this whole period there was also a lot of investigation into particular categories themselves.
Right, like specific categories like substance or relation.
Exactly. And they would often go into like really, really deep detail on those specific categories.
So it was a very rich and multifaceted area of inquiry.
Absolutely. Okay, so having surveyed the landscape, right? Like all the major areas of inquiry.
Yeah.
Let's turn our attention to the figure who really like laid the groundwork for so much of this discussion, right? Aristotle.
Right. Aristotle, the OG metaphysician.
I mean, his ideas were just so undeniably foundational for medieval thinkers. Like they couldn't get away from him.
Yeah, his shadow looms large over the entire medieval period.
It does. It does. So Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BCE, he's the original source for the theory of categories.
Yeah.
But even today, like interpreting his own view, like it remains like a really complex task for philosophers.
Really. Like, even after all this time, we're still not sure exactly what he meant.
Exactly. There's still like active debate about whether he considered categories primarily as features of reality,
Okay.
as concepts within the mind,
Uh-huh.
or as linguistic terms,
Or maybe all three.
or maybe some combination of all three.
So he wasn't exactly clear on this point.
No, he wasn't. And this ambiguity, it really like reverberates through the entire medieval tradition.
I see. It's like he left this puzzle for later generations to solve.
He did, and the Greek term that he used, categoria, this translates to predicate, right?
Predicate.
So this initially suggests that he was concerned with like the most general kinds of things we can say about something, like the ultimate classifications of predicate.
Okay, that makes sense. Like, if you think about grammar, predicates are the parts of a sentence that tell us something about the subject. So Aristotle is maybe trying to figure out, like, what are the most general kinds of predicates that we use?
Exactly, and some scholars argue that Aristotle's categories they're fundamentally kinds of predication,
Mhm.
even fundamental kinds of being.
Right, because what we can say about something is often tied to what that thing is, right?
Exactly. And in his work, categories, he presents his famous list, right?
Oh, the famous 10 categories. Let's hear them.
Okay, so you have substance, you have quantity,
Okay, substance and quantity.
quality,
Got it.
relation, place,
Okay, relation, place, keeping track,
time, position, state,
just position, state. This is a lot to remember.
and then action and affection.
Action and affection. All right, I think I got them all. 10 categories.
10 categories. And these aren't just arbitrary terms, right?
Right, they're supposed to be like the most fundamental ways of classifying things.
Exactly. They're meant to be the most general classifications under which like all of our predicates can ultimately be like subsumed.
Okay, so like red itself wouldn't be a category, but quality would be.
Yeah.
Because red is a kind of quality.
Exactly. And this goes back to that ambiguity that we were talking about earlier, right?
Mm.
Concerning the ontological status of these categories.
Right. Like, did Aristotle think these categories just reflect the structure of our language, or did they actually map onto like the underlying structure of reality?
Exactly. And he uses language, he talks about said of, which
Yeah.
definitely points towards the linguistic realm.
Okay.
But he also uses the language of being. He talks about things that are and this seems to point towards, ontology towards like the real nature of things.
So he's kind of playing both sides.
He is. So for instance, right, he says of things said without any combination, each signifies either a substance or quantity or qualification.
Okay, so that sounds pretty linguistic. He's talking about how things are signified.
Exactly. But then like in another passage, he says of things that are some are said of a subject but are not in any subject. For example, man is said of a subject, the individual man, but is not in any subject.
Okay, now he's talking about things that are about being,
Yeah.
but he's still using the language of set of predication.
Exactly. So he's moving back and forth between these two different ways of talking about categories, and
Yeah.
and this is part of what makes him so difficult to interpret.
Right. He's not giving us a clear answer on whether categories are linguistic or ontological or both.
Exactly.
So what about the notion of categories as concepts? Did Aristotle explicitly talk about them in that way?
Not directly within the categories itself. Like his focus there is really on like how things are named or predicated.
Oh.
But if you consider some of his other works, like on interpretation,
Okay, on interpretation.
where he posits that spoken sounds are symbols of what he calls like affections in the soul.
Affections in the soul. What are those?
Well, we can reasonably interpret those as concepts, right?
So like mental representations of things.
Exactly. And he says that these affections are likenesses of actual things.
So our concepts are supposed to resemble the things they represent.
Right. So from this we can kind of infer that he probably did recognize like a conceptual dimension to the categories.
Okay, so even though he doesn't explicitly use the word concept,
Mm.
it seems like he's thinking along those lines.
Exactly. And the source points out that Aristotle, he never definitively assigned the study of categories to a single discipline.
He didn't.
No, he addresses them both in his logical writings and in his metaphysical writings.
So he's kind of blurring the lines between logic and metaphysics.
He is, and this is actually really important for understanding, the later medieval debates.
How so?
Well, because the question of like whether categories are a subject for logic, right? The study of reasoning and language,
How?
or for metaphysics, the inquiry into the fundamental nature of reality.
Right.
This becomes a really, really central point of contention.
I see. So they're trying to figure out, like, is this a question about how we think and talk,
Mm.
or is it a question about how reality is structured?
Exactly. And Aristotle himself, he seems to have like operated in both domains.
So he's not really helping us to answer this question.
No, he's not. And then to complicate things even further, his approach to categories actually shifted, over time.
It did.
Yeah. So sometimes he would consider categories in like isolation, right? Just as like these basic kinds of things. But then other times he would tie them very, very closely to predication and like sentential structure.
The sentential structure.
Yeah, like how categories function within actual sentences.
Okay, so he's thinking about them both in terms of their own nature and in terms of how they're used in language.
Exactly. And this has led to some pretty divergent interpretations, even among modern scholars.
How so?
Well, so for instance, right, you have someone like Michael Freud who argues that categories are fundamentally kinds of predication.
Okay.
So for him, it's all about how we talk about things.
Right.
Whereas you have someone like Gilbert Ryle who sees categories as being like independent of syntax.
Independent of syntax.
Yeah, like he thinks they have this kind of like inherent logical structure that doesn't depend on how they're used in language.
So two very different ways of understanding what Aristotle was up to.
Exactly. And this kind of like tension, between these different perspectives, it really runs through the whole medieval tradition.
It sounds like Aristotle was a master at leaving these tantalizing puzzles for later generations to grapple with.
He was. Okay, so let's jump forward a few centuries, right?
Okay, time travel.
To the early Middle Ages, spanning roughly, 500 to 1150 AD.
All right, the early Middle Ages. What's going on with categories during this time?
So during this period, the dominant mode of philosophical activity was the writing of commentaries.
Commentaries.
Yeah, commentaries on established, like, authoritative texts.
Okay, so they're basically explaining and interpreting the works of earlier philosophers.
Exactly. And Aristotle's categories, this was like the key text in this regard.
Really? Like it was that important?
It was. We have hundreds of extant Latin commentaries from this era alone.
Hundreds. Wow.
Yeah, and these weren't just passive restatements of Aristotle,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
They were often vehicles for the commentators to develop their own, philosophical insights and to engage in these really, really subtle debates.
So they were using Aristotle as a springboard for their own philosophical explorations.
Exactly, exactly. And the intellectual legacy of the ancient world, particularly Neoplatonism,
Neoplatonism.
this played a really, really significant role in shaping these early interpretations.
Oh, interesting. So they're bringing in ideas from other philosophical traditions as well.
They are. So for instance, you have figures like Simplicius.
Simple fish.
He was a late Neoplatonist philosopher, and his commentary on the categories was really, really influential, even though it wasn't fully translated into Latin until later.
Okay. And what did he have to say about categories?
Well, he actually tried to demonstrate that there were like precisely 10 categories.
10, huh? Sticking with Aristotle's number.
Yeah, and this actually becomes a real like point of contention,
Yeah.
in later centuries. But in the Western Latin tradition, the most immediately influential commentator was Boethius.
Boethius.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and Boethius was really, really dedicated to preserving Greek philosophy.
He was.
Yeah, he translated a lot of Plato and Aristotle into Latin, and his translations of and commentaries on the categories, on interpretation, and on Porphyry's Isagon.
He's a gauge.
Yeah, it's like an introduction to Aristotle's logic.
Okay.
Those were just foundational for medieval logic.
So Boethius was kind of like the bridge between ancient Greek philosophy and the medieval Latin world.
Exactly. And the source points out that the direct influence of a lot of the ancient Greek commentaries was actually quite limited in the early Latin Middle Ages.
It was. Why is that?
Because Greek language proficiency in the West was declining.
Oh, right. So they couldn't read the original Greek text anymore.
Exactly. And with the closure